At Christmas dinner, my son shouted, "This seat is for the man who provides for the family, not for you. Let me sit." Everyone laughed while I stayed silent. That night, I did something that showed who the real provider was. He ended up begging me for help. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought Christmas Eve would become the night my own son showed me exactly how little I meant to him. At 62, I'd seen my share of disappointments, but nothing prepared me for what Charles did that night. The dining room was perfect, just like every year. Martha had spent days preparing the traditional feast: roasted turkey, honey-glazed ham, her famous stuffing recipe that had been in her family for generations. The china gleamed under the chandelier, the one I'd bought her for our 25th wedding anniversary. Red and gold candles flickered between garlands of pine, creating that warm Christmas glow that used to make me feel proud of what we'd built together. Our whole family was there. Charles sat across from me with his wife Jessica, a woman who'd never liked me from the day they met. She had this way of looking at me like I was something unpleasant she'd stepped in. Their twin boys, my grandsons Jake and Tyler, both 15 now, were hunched over their phones as usual, barely acknowledging anyone existed. My daughter Sarah had driven up from Atlanta with her husband Mike and their little girl Emma. At least Sarah still hugged me when she arrived, though I could tell she was already walking on eggshells around Charles. She always did that, trying to keep the peace between us. The trouble started before we even sat down to eat. I was moving toward my usual spot at the head of the table, the chair I'd occupied for every family dinner in this house for over 30 years. It wasn't about power or control. It was just where I'd always sat, where Martha expected me to sit when she set the table. "Whoa there, Dad." Charles's voice cut through the cheerful chatter like a blade. "That seat's taken." I stopped, confused. "What do you mean?" He was already moving past me, his hand gripping the back of my chair. "This spot is for the man who actually supports this family. The one who pays the bills and makes the real decisions." His voice was loud enough that everyone heard, not for someone living off Social Security. The room went dead silent. I felt my face burn with embarrassment as every pair of eyes turned toward me. Jessica smirked, actually smirked, like she was watching her favorite TV show. The boys looked up from their phones just long enough to snicker. "Charles, maybe we should just—" Sarah started, but her husband Mike put a hand on her arm to stop her. "No, it's fine," Charles continued, settling into my chair with exaggerated comfort. "Dad can sit anywhere else. This is where the head of household belongs." I stood there like an idiot, holding Martha's carefully arranged place setting in my hands. My wife, the woman I'd loved for 38 years, said nothing. She just stared at her hands, avoiding my eyes completely. "But honey," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady, "this is where I always sit." Charles laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "Yeah, well, times change. Jessica and I are the ones keeping this family afloat now. We pay for the boys' private school. We help with the house expenses. We even paid for Sarah's car repairs last month. What exactly do you contribute?" My throat felt tight. I wanted to tell him about the 20 years I'd worked double shifts at the factory to pay for his college. About the second mortgage I'd taken to help him buy his first house. About the $15,000 I'd quietly given Martha just last month when she said we were behind on the property taxes. But I didn't say any of that. I just stood there, feeling smaller by the second. "Clifford, just sit over there." Martha finally spoke, pointing to a chair at the far end of the table, the spot we usually reserved for the youngest grandchild. Her voice was tired, defeated, like she couldn't fight this battle anymore. Jessica leaned back in her chair, watching me with obvious satisfaction. "It's really for the best, Clifford. Charles has such a stressful job managing that investment firm. He needs to feel respected when he comes home." The boys were openly laughing now. Jake, the bolder of the twins, actually pointed at me. "Grandpa got demoted." Tyler joined in, making exaggerated sad faces while they high-fived each other. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, crack, like ice on a frozen pond when the temperature starts to rise. I set down the place setting and walked to the end of the table. Sat in that tiny chair like an afterthought, like a child who'd been sent away from the adults. Through the whole meal, I barely spoke. Every time I tried to join the conversation, Charles would interrupt or change the subject. When he started telling everyone about his latest big deal at work, some investment portfolio worth millions that he was supposedly managing, I watched the family hang on his every word. The same family that used to ask me about my day, about my thoughts, about my life. Now I was invisible. After dinner, While the women cleaned up and the men moved to the living room, Charles cornered me in the hallway. His breath smelled like the expensive whiskey I'd bought for the occasion. "Look, Dad," he said, not meeting my eyes. "I know tonight was rough, but you need to understand something. This family needs leadership, and that's my job now. You had your turn." I stared at him. This man I'd raised, whose diapers I'd changed, whose little league games I'd never missed even when I was exhausted from work. "When did I stop being your father?" "You didn't stop being my father," he said impatiently, "but you stopped being relevant." That word hit me like a physical blow. Irrelevant. That's what I'd become to my own son. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and Martha was already asleep, I sat in my workshop in the basement. It's where I go when I need to think, surrounded by the tools I've collected over the years and the projects I work on to keep my hands busy. But that night, I wasn't building anything. I was remembering. Remembering the day Charles was born, how he fit in my hands like he was made to be there. Remembering teaching him to ride a bike, to throw a baseball, to drive a car. Remembering the pride in his eyes when I walked him down the aisle at his wedding, how he'd squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Thanks for everything, Dad." When had that changed? When had I become the enemy? I knew the answer, even though I didn't want to admit it. It changed when I stopped saying no, when I started giving him everything he wanted instead of everything he needed, when I confused love with indulgence and turned my son into a man who believed the world owed him everything. Sitting there in the quiet darkness of my workshop, I made a decision that would change everything. If Charles thought I was irrelevant, maybe it was time to show him exactly how relevant I really was. The morning after Christmas, I couldn't sleep past 5 a.m. That's nothing new. My body's been waking me up at dawn for 40 years of factory work, and retirement hasn't changed the habit. But that morning felt different, heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on my chest. Martha was still asleep, her back turned to me the way it had been for months now. We used to wake up tangled together, but somewhere along the way, we'd started sleeping like strangers, sharing a bed. I slipped out quietly and made my way to the kitchen. The dining room still smelled like pine and candle wax. Martha hadn't taken down the Christmas decorations yet, and seeing that empty chair at the head of the table, my chair, brought everything rushing back. Charles's voice echoing in my head. "This spot is for the man who actually supports this family." I poured myself coffee and sat at the kitchen counter instead, staring out at the backyard where I'd taught Charles to throw a football, where we'd built that treehouse together when he was 8, spending every weekend for 2 months sawing boards and hammering nails. His little hands trying so hard to help, even though he mostly just got in the way. That's when the memories really started flooding back, like someone had opened a dam I'd been holding shut for years. I remembered the day Charles came home from high school, throwing his acceptance letter from Northwestern University on the kitchen table like it was no big deal. "I got in," he'd said, barely looking up from his phone. "But it's going to cost about $60,000 a year." $60,000. I made $42,000 that year working overtime at the plant. But I didn't hesitate. I took out a second mortgage on the house, cashed in my retirement fund early, paying the penalties, picked up weekend work doing handyman jobs for neighbors, spending my only days off fixing other people's leaky faucets and broken steps. Martha had worried. "Clifford, how are we going to manage this?" she'd asked, holding the mortgage papers with shaking hands. "We'll figure it out," I'd told her. "Charles is smart. This is his chance to have the life we never could." And I meant it. Every blister on my hands, every ache in my back from those 18-hour days, every dinner I missed because I was working late, it was all worth it if it meant Charles could have opportunities I'd never had. When he graduated, he'd hugged me at the ceremony. "Thanks, Dad. I know this wasn't easy." For a moment, I thought I'd done something right, that all those sacrifices had taught him to value what he'd been given. I was wrong. The next memory hit me like a punch to the gut. Charles coming home 3 months after graduation, panic in his eyes. "Dad, I need help. I made some mistakes with credit cards in college. I owe about $25,000. $25,000. I'd just finished paying off the student loans, and we were barely keeping our heads above water. But Charles was my son, my only son. What was I supposed to do? I liquidated what was left of my retirement savings. Sold the vintage Mustang I'd been restoring in the garage, the one I dreamed of driving in my golden years. Took a third part-time job cleaning offices at night, mopping floors until midnight, and then getting up at 5 for my shift at the factory. Martha tried to talk me out of it. Clifford, he needs to learn responsibility. This isn't helping him. He's young, I'd argued. Everyone makes mistakes. We help our children. That's what parents do. But it didn't stop there. It never stopped. When Charles wanted to buy his first house at 26, I co-signed the loan. When his credit wasn't good enough for the neighborhood he wanted, I put my name on the mortgage, just until I established myself. He'd promised 2 years max, and I'll refinance in my name only. That was 10 years ago. My name is still on that mortgage. When Jessica wanted a big wedding, Charles came to me again. Dad, her family is contributing $30,000, but we need another 20 to do it right. You want your son to be embarrassed in front of his in-laws? I borrowed against the house again. Watched Charles and Jessica dance at their reception in a venue that cost more than I made in 6 months, wearing suits and dresses that cost more than my monthly salary. They looked so happy, so perfect. I told myself it was worth every penny. The pattern continued for years. Charles's business ventures that needed just a small investment to get started. The down payment for Jessica's luxury SUV. Private school tuition for the twins. Every time, it was an emergency. Every time, he promised it was the last time. Every time, I said yes. And slowly, over the years, Charles stopped saying thank you. Stopped acknowledging the sacrifices. Started talking about everything I'd given him like it was something he'd earned. Something he deserved. The final blow came 2 years ago. Charles had been struggling with his investment business, though he never told me that directly. I only found out when Martha mentioned that Jessica had been complaining about money troubles to her friends at church. I went to Charles, offering to help one more time. Son, if you're having difficulties, maybe I can... Dad, stop. He'd cut me off, not even looking up from his laptop. I don't need your pity money. I'm not a charity case. But 6 months later, Jessica called me directly. Clifford, Charles is too proud to ask, but we're behind on the mortgage. If we don't come up with $8,000 by Friday, we could lose the house. $8,000. I didn't have it. I'd given everything I had to Charles over the years, and my Social Security barely covered our own bills. But I couldn't let my grandsons be homeless. I sold Martha's jewelry, the earrings I'd given her for our anniversary, the necklace that had been her mother's. I told her they'd been stolen, couldn't bear to see the disappointment in her eyes if she knew the truth. When I handed Charles the check, he barely glanced at it. Thanks, he'd muttered, like I'd just handed him a stick of gum. That night, Martha had cried about the stolen jewelry. I held her while she sobbed about losing her mother's necklace, and I hated myself for lying to her. But what else could I do? Tell her that our son, the boy we'd sacrificed everything for, couldn't even be bothered to say thank you anymore. Sitting in my kitchen that morning after Christmas, adding up all those years of giving in my head, I realized something that made my stomach turn. I'd given Charles everything, my savings, my retirement, my wife's jewelry, my own dreams. And somehow, he'd convinced himself that I was the one who wasn't contributing enough. The worst part wasn't the money. Money can be earned back, even at 62. The worst part was realizing that in trying to give my son everything, I'd taught him that he deserved everything, that other people existed to serve his needs, that gratitude was optional and respect was something he could withdraw whenever he felt like it. I'd created the very monster who'd humiliated me at my own dinner table, but sitting there in the morning light, surrounded by the quiet of my own kitchen, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, clarity. For the first time since Charles was born, I wasn't thinking about what he needed or wanted. I was thinking about what I needed. What I deserved. And what I deserved wasn't to be treated like a burden by the child I'd given my life to support. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Charles's name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I thought maybe he was calling to apologize, to acknowledge how he'd acted the night before. I answered hopefully. Hello, son. Dad, I need you to watch the boys this weekend. Jessica and I are going to that resort in Aspen, and our usual babysitter canceled. Not, how are you doing after last night? Not, I'm sorry for humiliating you. Just another demand for another favor. I stared out the window at the treehouse we'd built together all those years ago, now weathered and empty. I'll have to check with your mother, I said finally. Whatever, just figure it out. We already paid for the trip. He hung up without saying goodbye. That's when I knew what I had to do. 3 days after Charles hung up on me about babysitting, I did something I'd never done before in 35 years of being his father. I started paying attention to the details of his life, instead of just blindly supporting whatever he told me he needed. It started accidentally. I was at the hardware store picking up some parts for a leaky faucet when I ran into Bob Martinez, who used to work with me at the factory. We got to talking, and somehow the conversation turned to our kids. "Your boy Charles is doing real well for himself," Bob said, loading a bag of cement into his truck. "My nephew works at that casino downtown. Says Charles is in there pretty regular. High roller tables dropping serious money." I felt my stomach drop. "Casino?" "Yeah, you know, the Riverboat Palace. Tony says Charles is there 2-3 nights a week. Always betting big, though Tony says he's been losing more than winning lately." Bob shrugged. "But hey, when you're making investment banker money, I guess you can afford to play." I drove home in a daze. Charles had never mentioned gambling to me. Ever. In fact, he'd always talked about how careful he was with money, how every dollar had to be accounted for in his business. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Bob's words, about all the times Charles had come to me for emergency money over the years. How many of those emergencies had actually been gambling debts? The next morning, while Martha was at her book club, I did something that felt like a betrayal, but somehow necessary. I called my old friend Tom Patterson, who works at First National Bank where Charles has his accounts. Tom and I had served in Vietnam together, and he'd helped me set up Charles as an authorized user on some of my credit cards years ago. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." "Sure, Cliff. What's on your mind?" "Charles has been coming to me for money pretty regularly. Says it's for business emergencies, house payments, that kind of thing. But I'm starting to wonder if there's more to it." There was a long pause. "Cliff, you know I can't discuss specific account details, but as a friend, has Charles told you about the personal loans he's taken out using your co-signature?" My blood went cold. "What personal loans?" "3 of them in the past 18 months, totaling about $47,000, all requiring immediate family co-signers because of his credit rating." $47,000? In loans I knew nothing about, with my name attached to them. "Tom," I said, my voice barely steady, "I never signed anything." Another pause, longer this time. "Cliff, I think you and I need to have a conversation in person. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" That night was the longest of my life. I sat in my workshop, surrounded by all the tools I'd collected over the years, trying to make sense of what I'd learned. My son, the boy I'd sacrificed everything for, had been forging my signature on loan documents, using my credit, my reputation, my financial stability to cover his gambling debts. The next morning, Tom showed me the paperwork, my signature, perfectly forged on document after document. Charles had been studying my handwriting for years, apparently. Every birthday card I'd signed, every check I'd written him, he'd been learning how to replicate it. "The worst part," Tom said quietly, "is that he's been telling people around town that you're helping him with these investments, making it sound like you're his silent partner in some big business deals." "What business deals?" Tom looked uncomfortable. "Cliff, Charles doesn't run an investment firm. He works part-time at Morrison & Associates doing basic financial planning for middle-class families. Has for the past 3 years. Before that, he was unemployed for 8 months. The room started spinning. But he talks about managing million-dollar portfolios, about big clients. "I'm sorry, Cliff, I thought you knew." I walked out of that bank feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Everything I thought I knew about my son's life was a lie. The successful business, the important clients, the financial stability, all of it was fiction. Charles had been living off gambling winnings when he was lucky, and off loans taken in my name when he wasn't. But I wasn't done discovering the truth. That afternoon, I drove to the address Charles had given me for his office. It was supposed to be this prestigious financial consulting firm in the business district. Instead, I found a small accounting office in a strip mall between a nail salon and a sandwich shop. Through the window, I could see Charles sitting at a desk, helping an elderly woman with what looked like basic tax paperwork. I sat in my car for an hour, watching my son work his part-time job, while the weight of his deception settled over me like a heavy blanket. Every time he'd told me about his important meetings and high-profile clients, he'd been lying. Every time he'd bragged at family dinners about his business success, it was all made up. The next revelation came from an unexpected source. Jessica's sister Karen called me that evening, her voice tight with anger. "Clifford, I don't know if this is my place, but I think you should know something. Jessica has been telling everyone that you're paying for the boys' private school because Charles's business is going through a temporary rough patch. She's been using that excuse for 2 years now. My hands started shaking. What do you mean? The tuition, the car payments, even their mortgage. She's been telling our whole family that you insisted on helping because you wanted to invest in your grandson's future. She makes it sound like you're this generous grandfather who just loves spoiling them. I closed my eyes, feeling sick. Charles and Jessica had been using me as their personal bank account while telling everyone it was my idea, making me look like either a fool or a sugar daddy, depending on how you looked at it. There's more, Karen continued. Jessica's been complaining to our mother about how demanding you are, how you expect constant gratitude for your help. She says you guilt-trip them all the time about money. That was the final blow. Not only had they been stealing from me, they'd been painting me as the villain in their story, making me out to be some controlling old man who used money to manipulate his family. That night, I sat Martha down and told her everything. About the forged loans, about Charles's real job, about the gambling, about the lies. I watched my wife's face crumble as she realized that our son had been deceiving us for years. How could we have been so blind? She whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Because we wanted to believe in him, I said, because we loved him so much that we stopped seeing who he really was. Martha cried for hours that night, not just for the money or the lies, but for the loss of the son we thought we had. The successful businessman who called us for advice, who seemed to have his life together, who we were proud to claim as our child, that man didn't exist. He never had. The Charles who really existed was a part-time employee with a gambling problem who'd been stealing from his own parents for years while making them look like fools to everyone they knew. But as devastating as these discoveries were, they also gave me something I hadn't expected: clarity. For the first time in decades, I could see the situation clearly, without the fog of parental love and wishful thinking clouding my judgment. Charles had made his choices. He'd chosen to lie, to steal, to gamble away every opportunity he'd been given. He'd chosen to humiliate me at Christmas dinner while owing me tens of thousands of dollars. He'd chosen to use my love for him as a weapon against my own financial security. Now it was time for me to make some choices of my own. The next morning, I called Tom at the bank and asked him to prepare documentation of all the fraudulent loans. Then I called a lawyer. Not for Charles this time, but for me. It was time to protect what was left of my family's future, even if that meant protecting it from my own son. As I sat in the lawyer's office later that day, signing papers to begin the process of financial separation from Charles, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. For the first time since he was born, I was putting my own welfare first, and it felt like waking up from a very long, very expensive dream. The hardest part about taking action wasn't the decision itself, it was keeping quiet about it. For 3 weeks after discovering the truth about Charles, I went about my daily routine as if nothing had changed. I smiled when he called asking for favors. I nodded when Martha talked about how proud she was of his success. I even agreed to babysit the twins that weekend he'd demanded, watching my grandsons while their father was probably at the casino losing more money he didn't have. But behind the scenes, I was methodically dismantling every financial connection between my son and my family's security. My lawyer, Patricia Gonzalez, was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in elder financial abuse. When I first told her my story, she'd seen this kind of thing before. "Mr. Holloway, what your son has been doing is called financial elder abuse, and it's more common than you'd think. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' money often cross lines they never intended to cross. I don't want to destroy him," I'd told her. "I just want to protect what's left. Then we'll do this carefully and legally. But you need to understand, once we start this process, your relationship with your son is going to change permanently." I thought about Charles's voice at Christmas dinner. "This spot is for the man who actually supports this family." The irony was so thick I could taste it. "It already has changed," I said. "The first step was securing my own accounts. Patricia helped me open new banking accounts at a different institution, accounts that Charles had no access to or knowledge of. I transferred my Social Security payments, my small pension, and what remained of my savings. It wasn't much. Charles had seen to that over the years, but it was mine. Next came the credit cards. Charles had been using 3 cards that listed me as the primary account holder, running up balances and making minimum payments when he remembered to. The statements came to my house, but I'd stopped opening them years ago, trusting Charles when he said he was handling everything. When I finally looked at those statements, I nearly had a heart attack. $23,000 in combined debt, most of it cash advances and casino charges. No wonder Charles had been so stressed lately. Patricia walked me through the process of removing Charles as an authorized user and transferring the debt responsibility back to him. This will affect his credit rating severely, she warned. His credit rating is already bad, I said. That's why he's been using mine. The mortgage situation was more complicated. My name was on Charles's house loan as a co-signer, which meant I was legally responsible if he defaulted. But Patricia found a clause in the contract that allowed me to remove myself if I could prove fraudulent activity by the primary borrower. The forged loan documents will be key here, she explained. If we can prove a pattern of fraud, the bank will likely allow you to withdraw from the co-signature agreement. While Patricia handled the legal paperwork, I took care of the practical matters. I canceled the automatic transfers that had been sending $500 a month to Charles's account for emergency expenses. I stopped the direct payment of the twins' private school tuition. I called the insurance company and removed Charles and his family from my auto insurance policy. Each action felt like cutting a rope that had been strangling me for years. The most difficult part was dealing with Martha. She knew something was wrong. I'd told her about the fraud, about the lies, but she didn't know the extent of what I was doing to separate us from Charles financially. "Clifford, are you sure about this?" she asked one morning, finding me at the kitchen table with bank statements spread out everywhere. "He's still our son." "That's exactly why I'm doing this," I said. "Because he's our son, and sons aren't supposed to steal from their parents." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "But what if he really needs help? What if this gambling thing is an addiction, like a disease?" I reached across the table and took her hand. "Honey, we've been helping him for 20 years. Look where it's gotten us. Look where it's gotten him." She was quiet for a long time. Finally, she nodded. "What do you need me to do?" That afternoon, Martha called Charles and told him she was having some woman problems and needed to go to the doctor more often. She asked if he could start picking up his own dry cleaning and handling his own car maintenance, things I'd been quietly taking care of for years. "It's just temporary," she told him sweetly, "until I get these health issues sorted out." Charles, predictably, was irritated. "Can't you just push through it? I've got a lot going on at work." "I'm sorry, honey. I'll try to get better soon." Even that small boundary felt like a victory. The bank called me on a Tuesday morning in February. Tom Patterson's voice was professional but sympathetic. "Cliff, I wanted to give you a heads up. Charles came in yesterday trying to take out another personal loan. When we told him it would require your signature, he got pretty agitated. Started making some claims about you promising to help him with a business investment." "What did you tell him?" "That we'd need to speak with you directly before processing any loan applications." He left pretty angry. I knew Charles would be calling me soon, and I was right. My phone rang an hour later. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you meet me for lunch?" His voice had that strained quality it got when he was trying to control his temper. I agreed to meet him at the diner downtown, neutral territory where he couldn't make a scene. Charles was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with papers spread out in front of him. He looked tired, older somehow. The stress was starting to show. "Dad, I've got an incredible opportunity," he began before I'd even sat down. "There's this investment deal, a real estate development project that needs immediate funding. If I can get a $20,000 loan approved by Friday, I can triple that money in 6 months. I sat down slowly, studying my son's face. The eagerness in his eyes, the practiced pitch, the sense of urgency designed to pressure me into quick agreement. How many times had I fallen for this exact routine? "Tell me about this real estate project," I said calmly. Charles launched into a detailed explanation about commercial properties and development partnerships and guaranteed returns. It sounded impressive, convincing even. If I hadn't spent the past month learning the truth about his life, I might have believed it. "The thing is," he continued, "my credit is temporarily tied up in other investments, so I need you to co-sign the loan. Just a formality. The return on investment will pay it off in no time." "What other investments?" Charles blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean? You said your credit is tied up in other investments. What investments?" He fumbled for a moment, clearly not expecting detailed questions. "Just some diversified portfolio stuff. Complex financial instruments. Nothing you'd be interested in." I nodded as if that made perfect sense. "And this real estate deal, who are the other partners?" "Dad, why are you grilling me like this? I thought you trusted me." "I do trust you," I lied smoothly. I just want to understand what I'm signing up for. Charles' expression shifted, became colder. Look, if you don't want to help me, just say so. But don't pretend this is about wanting information. You've never asked for details before. He was right. I'd never asked for details before. I'd just handed over money whenever he asked, trusting that my son would never lie to me about something important. Maybe that was a mistake, I said quietly. The temperature at our table dropped about 20 degrees. Charles stared at me like he'd never seen me before. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm 62 years old, Charles. I can't keep supporting everyone forever. I need to start thinking about my own future. Charles's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally manipulation. Dad, you're not thinking clearly. This isn't about supporting me forever. This is about a smart business investment that benefits both of us. Then invest your own money. I told you, my capital is tied up in gambling debts. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. Charles went completely still, his face draining of color. What did you say? I know about the casino, Charles. I know about the real loans you've taken out in my name. I know about your part-time job and your made-up investment firm. Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. For maybe the first time in his adult life, he had nothing to say. I stood up slowly, leaving a $5 bill on the table for my coffee. Son, this conversation is over, and so is my financial support. Walking away from that diner, leaving Charles sitting there in stunned silence, I felt lighter than I had in 20 years. The hardest part was done. Now I just had to wait for the consequences to catch up with him. I didn't have to wait long to see the effects of cutting Charles off financially. Within 2 weeks of our conversation at the diner, the phone calls started. Not from Charles himself. He was too proud for that, but from everyone around him. The first call came from Jessica on a Thursday evening. I was in my workshop, finally getting back to a bookshelf project I'd abandoned months ago, when Martha called down to tell me Jessica was on the phone, crying. Clifford, I don't understand what's happening. Jessica's voice was high and strained. Charles says you've cut him off from everything. The school called about the boys' tuition, the bank is asking about some loan payments, and Charles won't explain any of it to me. I set down my sandpaper and took a deep breath. Jessica, has Charles told you about his gambling? Silence. Then, what gambling? The casino visits. The money he's been losing at the Riverboat Palace 2 or 3 nights a week for the past year. I heard her sharp intake of breath. That's impossible. Charles works late those nights. He's at the office. No, he's not. Another long silence. When Jessica spoke again, her voice was different, smaller. How much money? I don't know the exact amount, but enough that he's been forging my signature on loan documents to cover his debts. The sound that came through the phone might have been a sob or a gasp. Oh my God, Clifford, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I believed her. Jessica might have been cold toward me over the years, but she wasn't stupid. If she'd known Charles was gambling away their security, she would have put a stop to it long before now. What am I supposed to do? She whispered. The mortgage payment is due next week and Charles says the money isn't there. He keeps saying you'll work something out, but I won't. I finished for her. Not this time. She hung up without saying goodbye. The next call came from my daughter Sarah, and that one was harder to take. Dad, what's going on with you and Charles? He called me last night saying you've lost your mind, that you're having some kind of breakdown and taking it out on him. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of family manipulation settling on my shoulders. Even now, Charles was trying to make me the villain in his story. Sarah, your brother has been stealing from me for over a year, forging my signature on loan documents to cover gambling debts. Dad, that's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation. It's a fact. I have the bank records. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Why didn't you tell me? Because I hoped I could handle it quietly, within the family. But Charles isn't interested in fixing this. He's only interested in getting more money. But Dad, if he has a gambling problem, isn't that an addiction? Shouldn't we be helping him get treatment instead of cutting him off? It was the same argument Martha had made, the same logic I'd used to justify enabling Charles for years. Help instead of consequences. Support instead of boundaries. Love instead of tough choices. I've been helping him for 20 years, Sarah. Look where it's gotten us. That weekend, Charles himself finally called. It was Sunday morning, and Martha and I were having coffee on the back porch when my phone rang. I'd been expecting this call, dreading it, but also knowing it was inevitable. Dad, his voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the desperation underneath. "We need to talk. I'm listening, not over the phone. Can you meet me somewhere?" An hour later, I sat across from Charles in the same diner where I'd confronted him about the real estate investment scam. But this time, he looked different, haggard. The confident businessman facade had cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "Dad, I'm in trouble." The words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them back for weeks. "Real trouble." I waited. "The house is going into foreclosure. The bank called Friday and said they're starting proceedings next month. Jessica doesn't know yet. I told her it was just a paperwork mix-up, but I don't know how much longer I can keep this from her." "What about your job?" Charles laughed bitterly. "What job? Morrison and Associates let me go last week. Said they were cutting back on part-time positions, but we both know it was because I'd been missing too many days. Missing days to gamble, I realized, but I didn't say it out loud. The car payments are behind too," he continued. "Jessica's SUV and my sedan. If I don't come up with $3,000 by Tuesday, they're going to repossess both vehicles." I felt a familiar pull, the paternal instinct to fix everything, to solve his problems with my checkbook. But I forced myself to stay quiet. "Dad, I know I've made mistakes. I know I haven't been the son you deserve. But I'm asking you, begging you, please help me one more time. Just enough to stop the foreclosure and catch up on the car payments. $10,000. And I swear I'll never ask you for another penny. $10,000. Money I didn't have, thanks to years of previous emergencies and investments. Money that would come from what little remained of my and Martha's security. Where would I get $10,000, Charles? You could take out a home equity loan. The house is paid off, right? The bank would approve it in a day. He wanted me to mortgage my own home to save his. The home Martha and I had worked 30 years to pay off, the one asset we had left for our old age. And if you can't pay it back, Charles's jaw tightened. I'll pay it back. I'm going to get clean, Dad. No more gambling. I'll get another job, maybe 2 jobs. I'll do whatever it takes. You've said that before. This time is different. Why? Because, Charles's voice cracked slightly, because I'm going to lose everything. Jessica, the boys, the house, everything I've worked for. The irony was painful. Charles had never worked for any of it. The house down payment had come from me. The cars were financed through my credit. Even his job had come through connections I'd helped him make. He'd built his entire adult life on a foundation of other people's money and support, and now that foundation was crumbling. "Charles," I said quietly, "what exactly have you worked for?" His face flushed red. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I paid for your college. I gave you the down payment for your house. I've been covering your mortgage when you couldn't. I've paid off your credit cards, your car loans, even your gambling debts. What part of your life have you actually worked for?" Charles stared at me like I'd slapped him. "I can't believe you're keeping score." "I'm not keeping score. I'm asking you to be honest about the situation. The situation is that I'm your son, and I need help. The situation is that you're a 35-year-old man who's never faced the consequences of his own choices, because I've always been there to bail you out." Charles's expression hardened. "So that's it? You're just going to let me lose everything?" "I'm going to let you save yourself. Or not. But either way, it's going to be your choice and your effort." Charles stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You know what, Dad? You've changed. You used to care about family. I used to confuse enabling with caring. Jessica was right about you," Charles said, his voice turning mean. "You are a bitter old man who uses money to control people." The accusation stung because it was so far from the truth. I'd never used money to control anyone. I'd given it freely, asked for nothing in return, and watched my son become someone I barely recognized. "Charles," I said, standing up slowly, "if that's what you really believe, then you're exactly where you need to be right now." I left him standing there in the diner, and this time, I didn't look back. 2 days later, Martha answered the phone while I was fixing a leaky pipe in the basement. When I came upstairs, she was sitting at the kitchen table with tears in her eyes. "That was the school," she said quietly. "The boys are being withdrawn. Jessica came to pick them up this morning with all their belongings." I felt my chest tighten. Whatever else Charles had done, the boys were innocent. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of their father's mess. "Did she say where they're going?" Martha nodded. "Jessica's parents. She's filed for separation and moved back home with the twins, so it was really happening." Charles was losing everything, just like he'd predicted. The house, the cars, his job, and now his family. Everything he'd claimed to be working for was gone. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. "Dad, it's Charles. Jessica took my phone when she left. I'm staying at a motel on Route 9. Room 23, please." I need to see you. I stared at the message for a long time. Martha, reading over my shoulder, put her hand on my arm. What are you going to do? I thought about the little boy who used to run to me when he scraped his knee, who trusted me to fix everything that went wrong in his world. I thought about the man who'd thrown me out of my own chair at Christmas dinner, who'd stolen my identity to fund his addiction. I'm going to see him, I said finally, but not to give him money. Martha squeezed my arm. What then? To give him the only thing I have left to offer, which is the truth. The Sunset Motel on Route 9 was exactly the kind of place you'd expect someone to end up when their life had completely fallen apart. Peeling paint, flickering neon sign, and parking lot full of potholes. I sat in my truck for a few minutes before walking to room 23, steeling myself for what I might find. Charles opened the door before I could knock. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was unwashed, his clothes wrinkled, and there was a smell of cheap whiskey on his breath. But what struck me most was his eyes. For the first time since he was a child, Charles looked truly afraid. "Dad," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "Thank you for coming." The room was small and depressing, with worn carpet and furniture that had seen better decades. Charles's clothes were scattered across one of the twin beds, and empty fast food containers covered the small table by the window. "Sit down," Charles said, gesturing to the only chair in the room. He perched on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Charles, you look terrible." He let out a bitter laugh. "I feel terrible. Jessica won't answer my calls. The boys don't even know where I am. I've lost everything, Dad. Everything." I waited for him to ask for money, to launch into another desperate pitch for a loan or an investment opportunity. But instead, Charles just sat there, staring at his hands. "I keep thinking about Christmas," he said finally. "About what I said to you at dinner, about how I treated you. What about it?" I was so wrong. His voice cracked slightly. "You were the one supporting the family. You always were. I just never wanted to see it. This wasn't what I'd expected. No demands, no schemes, no manipulation. Just admission of guilt from a man who'd lost everything because of his own choices. Charles, do you remember the treehouse we built when you were 8? He looked up, confused by the change of subject. "Yeah, in the backyard. Took us all summer." "Do you remember what you said when we finished it?" Charles shook his head. "You said, 'Dad, we built something that's going to last forever.' You were so proud of the work we'd done together." "I remember being proud," Charles said quietly. "That was the last time I saw that boy," I told him. "The boy who understood that things worth having require work and sacrifice. Somewhere along the way, that boy disappeared, and I enabled his disappearance by giving you everything instead of teaching you to build it yourself." Charles wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I know I became someone terrible, someone entitled and cruel. But Dad, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be the man you raised me to be. For 35 years, this would have been my cue to swoop in with solutions, to write a check, make some phone calls, smooth over the consequences of Charles's choices. But sitting in that depressing motel room, looking at my broken son, I realized that the kindest thing I could do was refuse to rescue him. "Charles, I can't fix this for you. I know. I'm not asking you to. I need to know that you don't hate me." The words hit me harder than I'd expected. For all of Charles's failures, for all the pain he'd caused, he was still my son, still the little boy who used to fall asleep in my arms during thunderstorms. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I can't keep enabling you either." Charles nodded, fresh tears starting to fall. "What am I supposed to do?" "You're supposed to start over. Get a job, any job, find a place you can actually afford, stop gambling completely, and most importantly, stop expecting other people to solve your problems. What if Jessica won't take me back? What if I can't see my boys? Then you'll have to live with those consequences and work to earn their trust back, just like you'll have to work to earn mine back." Charles was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "How do I earn your trust back?" I thought about all the lies, all the manipulation, all the years of taking my love for granted. "By becoming someone trustworthy, by proving through your actions, not your words, that you've changed. And if I do that, if I really change, really get my life together, will you forgive me?" I stood up slowly, my joints protesting after sitting in that uncomfortable chair. "Charles, forgiveness isn't something you earn like a paycheck. It's something that happens when you stop needing it." He looked confused, so I tried to explain. "Right now, you want my forgiveness because it would make you feel better about yourself. But real change happens when you care more about being a good person, then about being forgiven for being a bad one. I moved toward the door, then stopped. There's something else you need to know. What? I've spoken to a lawyer about the forged loan documents. I'm not pressing charges, but the bank has been notified. Your credit is going to be damaged for a long time. Charles's face went pale. Dad, I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing it to protect myself and your mother. We can't afford to be financially responsible for your choices anymore. He nodded slowly. I understand. I opened the door, then turned back one more time. Charles, there's a construction company called Henderson Builders looking for laborers. The pay is honest, the work is hard, and they don't care about your credit history. If you're serious about starting over, that's where I'd begin. You'd help me get a job. I'd give you a recommendation based on the boy you used to be, not the man you became. Whether you earn it or waste it is up to you. I left him sitting on that motel bed, and for the first time in decades, I felt like I'd actually helped my son, instead of just enabling him. 3 months later, Charles called me. Not for money, not for a favor, but to tell me he'd been sober from gambling for 90 days and had been promoted to crew supervisor at Henderson Builders. Dad, I wanted to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no pressure either way. What is it? Jessica and I are going to counseling. She's willing to try working things out, but she has conditions. One of them is that I make amends to the people I've hurt. That sounds like a good condition. I was wondering if you and Mom would be willing to have dinner with us. Nothing fancy, just the 4 of us. I want to apologize properly, and I want to thank you for not giving up on me when it would have been easier to just walk away. I thought about Christmas dinner 6 months ago, about sitting at the far end of my own table while Charles claimed my place and my authority. I thought about all the years of lies and manipulation and financial abuse. But I also thought about the man on the phone who was working an honest job, fighting an addiction, and trying to rebuild his family. A man who understood that respect had to be earned, not demanded. I'll talk to your mother, I said. But Charles, I need you to understand something. This dinner isn't about going back to the way things were. The way things were nearly destroyed both of our families. I know, Dad. I don't want to go back either. I want to go forward, but I want to do it right this time. 2 weeks later, Charles and Jessica came to our house for dinner. Not the formal dining room this time, but the kitchen table where we'd eaten most of our family meals when Charles was growing up. Before we ate, Charles stood up. Dad, Mom, I owe you both an apology. Not just for Christmas, but for years of taking advantage of your love and generosity. I stole from you, lied to you, and treated you like you existed to serve my needs. Jessica, sitting beside him, took his hand. We both owe you an apology. I was part of the problem too. Charles, I said, apologies are a good start, but what I really want to know is this. What's different now? Charles met my eyes steadily. What's different is that I'm not asking you for anything, except the chance to rebuild our relationship on honest ground. I'm supporting my own family now. I'm paying my own bills. And I'm taking responsibility for my own mistakes. And the gambling? I go to Gamblers Anonymous 3 times a week. I've turned over control of all finances to Jessica, and I've banned myself from every casino in the state. Martha reached across the table and squeezed Charles's hand. We're proud of you for getting help. It shouldn't have taken losing everything for me to get help, Charles said. But I'm grateful it happened before I lost you too. That night, for the first time in years, we had a family dinner where everyone was present and honest, where respect flowed in both directions, where my son treated me like a father instead of an ATM. As Charles and Jessica were leaving, Charles stopped at the door. Dad, there's something else I want to say. What's that? Christmas is coming up in a few months. If you'll have us, I'd like to come to dinner. But this time, I'll sit wherever you want me to sit. Because this is your house, and you're the head of this family. I looked at my son. Really looked at him and saw something I hadn't seen in decades. Humility, respect, the understanding that love isn't about what you can take from people, but what you can give to them. Charles, I said, next Christmas, you can sit right beside me. As I watched them drive away, Martha slipped her arm through mine. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about it for a moment. 6 months ago, I'd been invisible in my own family, disrespected by the son I'd sacrificed everything for, taken for granted by people who saw me as nothing more than a source of financial support. Tonight, I'd had dinner with a son who thanked me for setting boundaries, who respected my authority instead of challenging it. who understood that being a man meant taking care of his responsibilities, not finding others to take care of them for him. "I feel like a father again," I said, "and for the first time in years I feel like I've got my son back." Martha smiled and squeezed my arm. "The real question is, do you think he's really changed?" I thought about Charles working construction in the summer heat, earning every dollar through honest labor, about him going to counseling and addiction meetings, fighting to save his marriage, about the way he'd looked me in the eye when he apologized, without trying to minimize his mistakes or shift blame. "I think," I said slowly, "that losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to him. And cutting him off was the best thing I ever did for him." 6 months of silence and consequences had accomplished what 20 years of enabling never could. My son had finally learned what it meant to be a man, and I had finally learned what it meant to be a father who loved his child enough to let him fail. Standing on my front porch that night, watching the stars come out over the neighborhood where I'd raised my family, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing. Charles had his respect back, but more importantly, he'd earned it, and that made all the difference.